So good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute, a nonpartisan think tank promoting American leadership and global engagement for a secure, free, and prosperous future. Little to argue there, I suppose. I'm Charles Davidson, the Executive Director of the Kleptocracy Initiative here at the Hudson Institute, and we research how the combination of autocracy and globalized corruption threaten democracy, capitalism, and national security. Today, we're honored to welcome Mr. Oleksandr Danylyuk, the Finance Minister of Ukraine. Mr. Danylyuk began his career in the private sector as a consultant and investment manager, working with firms such as McKinsey & Company in Ukraine, London, and Moscow. He entered public service in 2005 as economic advisor to the then Prime Minister. From 2010 to 2015, he served as head of the Economic Reforms Coordination Center, an apolitical think tank under the aegis of the administration of the President of Ukraine. Following the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan protests, in 2014, he became President Poroshenko's representative at the Cabinet of Ministers and later the deputy head of the presidential administration. Mr. Danylyuk was instrumental in establishing the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption, as well as the introduction of wealth e-declarations for Ukrainian officials. Mr. Danylyuk succeeded Natalie Jaresko as Finance Minister of Ukraine in 2016. His stated priorities include creating a better investment climate in Ukraine, improving transparency for businesses, and public finance reform. Ukraine is a vital U.S. ally, which continues to face significant internal challenges and external threats. So we are very excited to host Minister Danylyuk for a conversation with Walter Russell Mead, a distinguished fellow here at Hudson Institute. Professor Mead is also the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, that's a mouthful, and editor-at-large of The American Interest, most importantly. The Minister Danylyuk will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation with Walter Mead, followed by questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Minister, it's yours. If you like, or sit here, which you prefer.
Yeah, let me stay here. I feel more important this way. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak here and tell you about reforming my country, Ukraine. As you've heard from my brief description of my experience, I've been around for quite a while and seen different stages of reforming the country. It's all started when I was still very, very young, right? Since independence. That's when Ukraine started its first reforms. We made a strategic choice towards democracy, towards market economy. Since then, some problems were resolved, some problems stayed, some even worsened, because any problem which is not being resolved actually gets worse and worse. But if you look for the last 25 years, we have a totally different country now. With all these years, as a part of policy, we were Ukraine leadership kept this multi-vector approach. It all changed. It's all changed since the Revolution of Dignity in the beginning of 2014. where we made our clear choice that we go to Europe and we intensify our reforms. And our neighbor to the east became an aggressor. And that was a new reality for Ukraine, which also impacted the reform dynamics in the country. That was also an opportunity in 2014 to do the most important, the most difficult reform that Ukraine had to do many years ago. Unfortunately, that some of this opportunity was missed. And still some reforms like pension reform, land market reform, they're still on our agenda. And as I said, if that reforms are not done, they become more and more of a problem. Look at the pension system. If we don't reform pension system now, we cannot guarantee to our citizens, to our pensioners, that in several years they will be able to get guaranteed pension. With land market, Ukraine is in a unique situation when many years ago our parliament decided to forbid the landowners, citizens who own the land, to sell the land that they own. Quite unusual, especially for the United States, but I believe for many countries in the world. It was done. Now we need to reverse it. Otherwise, the foundation of our economy at this stage, agriculture sector, cannot develop further. So those are things that ahead of us. But let me tell you where we are. Again, we missed some time in 2014. Patience of people are not as it was 3 years ago, so to say, and yet we need to do some unpopular reforms. It doesn't make it easy, but the current team is committed to do it. And we came to this point by making of the last year, when we first assumed office, our new government, some unpopular and difficult decisions. The first thing that we've done was to bring tariffs for gas to the market level. For Ukraine, it's a big issue. So this is the first thing that this new government did, is to increase tariffs to the market level. Why we've done it? Not to hurt people. We've done it to demonstrate that we are decisive. We understand that without doing this, we cannot reform the gas sector. We cannot become fully energy independent. So that was the logic. And I remember this discussion within the cabinet is whether we should do it or we should wait for another year, as IMF would suggest us. No, because on the IMF program, we were supposed to go to the market level pricing now. We've done a year ago. Why? Because we wanted to speed up reforms. That was the main logic. And I was very happy that it was supported, this position of Prime Minister was supported by my colleagues in the Cabinet of Ministers. And that basically set a tone for going forward. Then was the introduction of electronic declarations, asset declarations, which is important instrument in the whole system for fighting corruption. Then was the nationalization of the largest bank in the country, Privatbank, which happened to be owned by two oligarchs with quite significant influence over media in the country. And the bank itself was quite large, and it was quite risky to manage the transition. We didn't shy away, we did it. Although that has to be done years before. So we made these unpopular decisions in order now to embark on the most difficult one. As I said, it's a pension reform, it's a land market reform. And I'm very confident that we will be able to achieve it within the next months or two. What is very important to note about the dynamics of reforms. 3 years ago, or 2 years ago even, it was very common to say that this is an IMF program that has to be done. If you search now, over the last year, none of the members of the government said we do it because it's an IMF program. It's our conscious decision to say we do it because we believe it's right to do it. And we are together want to implement the reforms and to be proud of it. Not to shy away, but actually to be proud of the team that actually transformed the country. After we do land market reform, pension reform, and one important element, which is privatization, which was, I believe, a failure for so many years. All right? I would consider we almost complete IMF program. And at the moment, we're just midpoint of this program. My job now is to think what will happen after IMF program. As you know, it finishes at 2018. IMF was a strong partner and is a strong partner and supporting reforms in the country. But as every responsible politician, we should think what will happen afterwards. And afterwards, in 2018, we want to become a self-sufficient, competitive economy with access to international markets. So when we need financing, we can attract it. And we need to have a very strong case to present to the investors. This is for the bond markets. We also know that our future depends on our ability to bring private equity investors into the country. And this is another ambition for the next years, that what we do in the country, the reform that we do in the country, actually increase investment attractiveness. And let me tell you how we do that. Again, this is part of our discussions within the government. If we, let's take energy efficiency. It's a strange word, yeah? Energy efficiency, what does it mean? Now, we can listen to our European colleagues, some technical assistance, put it together. It's, nice words, good ideas, but unless you really understand why you want to do it, you won't be able to pursue it anywhere else. Why are we doing it? We actually create an opportunity for investors to come in. We understand that we, as a state, do not have resources to invest in energy efficiency. We need billions of dollars to do that. But we want to be energy independent, right? And we don't want to spend money on buying gas from Russia, for example. How we achieve it is, again, resources of the budget are very limited, is very limited. So what do? We put together a regulatory framework which create a market, an opportunity for private investors. They know that they come, if they invest in energy efficiency project, they guaranteed to get return back from the savings that they achieved. So this is what we do at the moment. Put regulatory frameworks in every single sector to create it, to make it attractive for investors to come in, to take this opportunity to develop the country. One of the problems that we do have, and I want to publicly recognize it, is that despite the fact that we're moving to the market-oriented economy, we do privatizations, we do just change regulatory environment for the private sector, Some of the areas, elements are still behind. And I'm talking about law enforcement. The law enforcement is still very much as it was during Soviet Union, quite repressive, and business doesn't like it, right? It's ineffective, expensive, and bad for business environment. So this is the last component, missing component that needs to be addressed in order for us to really progress with reforms. And what we do in this area? First of all, we set up 2 new institutions that main goal of which are fight with corruption. This Anti-Corruption Bureau, it's an agency that was set up from scratch with help of our American colleagues. Agency for Prevention Corruption, that's the agency that also totally new, that analyzes the electronic declarations of state officials, that look at the conflict of interest and the party financing. So these 2 institutions, it's a new law enforcement, basic enforcement mechanism that will work on new standards, right? Because the older institutions cannot do that. One of the biggest problems for the business in Ukraine was tax police. It was a part of state fiscal service, and it was ineffective, again, expensive for the state, and bad for business environment. So we eliminated at the beginning of this year, and we're about to set up a new institution, much smaller, 5 times smaller, with totally different approach to of working, right? It used to be people in Balaclava with machine guns, resolving the problems with those who don't pay taxes, which don't always need the special kit to do that. Sometimes first you start with some analytical approach, finding actually where the problems are, how you resolve it, right? And then maybe it will come to it. But that was actually the initial reaction. That's how they reacted. So not surprising that business was unhappy with this. So we eliminated tax police, and we are setting up the new institution, the Financial Investigation Service, 5 times smaller, analytical unit. Also, we're getting a technical support from our American colleagues to do it, because that requires a very special experience. Understanding how the tax evasion or some economic crimes are done in other countries. And this is also a cross-border problem now. So we're setting up this institution, not surprisingly that all institutions are fighting back. Everybody tries to defend their right to exist. So all this, at the moment, some people look and they say, listen, but if there is such a conflict, then maybe something is wrong. I think it's right. I think if there is a pushback from the old institutions, it means that new institutions are really effective. They're putting a threat and moving into the right direction. So, and I'm mentioning this because it's on my agenda, Financial Investigation Unit. This is something which I, as a minister, promote, and I'm supported by Prime Minister and President. National Anti-Corruption Bureau. It was also it was initiated by the president, and now it brings results. 2 years later, it was set up in 2014. Now it brings results. The most recent result was the arrest of head of state fiscal service. This is the highest ranked official arrested for corruption so far. It would be impossible to think about this 2 years ago. It's not even about political will. It's about capacity of institutions to do that. They just cannot do this. The new institution like an Anti-Corruption Bureau can do it. It sends very strong signals to everyone that actually Ukraine is serious about fighting corruption. Ukraine is serious about improving business climate. And when I now meet with investors, I feel totally different attitude now. I can now show them the results, what we achieved. When I meet with businesses who work in Ukraine, they tell me, VAT refunds that was a problem for many years, this problem will resolve now. It didn't happen by surprise overnight. It didn't happen on New Year Eve. It required some work from our side, but it was done. And now people or businesses trust us. And they tell to other investors, Ukraine is a good destination. So that's how we doing reforms, right? It's not always easy. There is some pushback, but we know where we're going, and we focus on very practical and pragmatic steps that build confidence from the society and builds confidence from business in the country. And that is the key to our success. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like it here.
All right, thank you very much. That was a great presentation and very helpful. Before we get started, I'm aware as someone who's been fortunate enough to visit Ukraine 3 times in the last 20 years, that Americans sometimes have a hard time grasping some essentials about the country. And in particular, I think it's important to point out as we listen to someone who's trying to help Ukraine reform and develop at this critical time, that we just put it in a little bit of context. So let me just quickly do that. And this is to say that Ukraine may have had the worst 20th century of any country in the world. That is, in the First World War, we in America don't often think about it, but some of the most difficult battles were fought on Ukrainian territory. Some of the greatest destruction of that war was in Ukraine. Then, when the war ended in 1918 in the West, a new period of war and instability was just getting underway in Ukraine that would go on for longer than the original war, where you have the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, much of which is fought in a particularly vicious and difficult way in Ukraine. And so you had a sort of a double period of mass murder, of dislocation, of devastation. Well, you have a few years of relative calm, and then Stalin's forced collectivization, again, kills literally millions of people across Ukraine in some of the worst examples of human suffering, dispossession, literally willed starvation in the history of mankind. That was over, and then very soon afterwards came the Second World War, again, where many of the greatest battles and the greatest suffering were on the territory of Ukraine, involved mass death, mass dislocation, destruction of infrastructure. And we can think of that in economic terms, but I think it's also important to think of what happens to family structures, to social capital, to questions like trust, to the relationships of governmental institutions with people. There are all kinds of complex ways in which that terrible history is still echoing and re-echoing inside Ukrainian institutions, in Ukrainian families, in Ukrainian churches and other groups. And so it's important, I think, that we bring a bit of perspective, because you often hear people saying, well, why can't they just fix it? Particularly from places that maybe haven't had experiences that are even comparable. So I would just like to say, Minister, I want to congratulate you and say that the work that you're doing is important, and not just important for the standpoint of a particular government in Ukraine, but for helping one of the countries in the world that really needs a fresh start in the 21st century to try to build that. So that's at least the perspective I come from all this on. Of course, having said all that, Ukraine, as in the past, still faces a whole set of extraordinary difficulties and dangers. What would you say is the greatest challenge facing Ukraine today? I realize you have so many choices now to think about, but
It's the biggest challenge now is to not to miss this opportunity to transform Ukraine. We still have this window open, and we have to do it. Yes, we had difficult past, and a lot of dark pages in our history, which explains why it's so difficult. But when you're in position to change something, you don't use for excuses why it's difficult. You need to do it and to be proud of it. So the biggest challenge is actually for the team of the reformers, which are currently in place, to transform the country, to make the changes irreversible. I can say they're irreversible already, right? I'm confident about this. Somebody say that, there is still some risks of history repeating and Ukraine again facing towards, Russia, for example, right? So I don't think this is a possibility, right? We clearly made our choice, not because of geography, but because of values. And Russia has to change itself, right? To become a democracy, to become, to respect people's rights in order for us to become, close again. So that's an opportunity to do that. It doesn't mean that, if we don't do, the window will not be another opportunity in the future. But we want the people who are currently around us, our citizens, friends, people who don't know, brothers, sisters, whatever, they deserve a better life. And this is our responsibility to give it to them.
Well, you're having a very busy week of the spring meeting of the IMF, and you're seeing a lot of your colleagues from around the world. What is the biggest economic concern that Ukraine is bringing to this meeting, and what is on your agenda as you participate in the IMF spring meeting?
Very important now is to get the most from the support we're getting from the International Financial Organization. There have been some examples where this support was ineffective. It's very important now to align our resources together so to make it success for Ukraine and for IFIs. And I have very specific proposals that we communicate to our partners. We improved, for example, our portfolio with World Bank. Historically, the disbursement rate was one of the lowest in the world, right? We actually addressed this problem so that every money, every dollar, which being allocated to Ukraine is used properly. Because we need these resources to speed up our reforms. So I'm not just coming with new ideas, I'm coming with specific proposals, and I hear positive feedback.
Now, after a period of negative growth, Ukraine's GDP started to expand last year and is projected to grow, though there seemed to be some sense that the growth rate may be slowing. What do you see as the medium-term outlook for Ukraine? What kind of growth can you expect, and how does this translate into better standards of living for more of the people in what remains one of Europe's poorest countries?
Last year, we first time demonstrated economic growth, which changed the trend after the several years of decrease in GDP. For this year, we expected around 3%. Unfortunately, we had to reduce this forecast by 1%, so 2%. And the reason for this, again, some actions taken by the Russia-supported quasi-republics on the east of the country, which basically our companies that paid taxes to Ukrainian budgets were confiscated. And so that, I think, the last thing, but still Russia can do it, they're quite limited in impacting us. So this is they tried to do it. Yes, we were hit by another 1%, but all these negative scenarios of, again, economy collapsing, this is just not true. We managed to build a strong economy, right? Again, it's not as strong as we want, but even such actions on behalf from side of our neighbor, right now we can withhold. So going forward, it's more up to us how we can grow. I believe that the rate of growth of 2 or 3% is unacceptable. This is not what people of Ukraine expect from us. This is not why we are, putting so much efforts in reforming the country, not to achieve such rates. We need to get a higher, this should be our ambition, a much higher growth rates. And I'm very, very confident that we will be able to do that. In order to do this, there are some things that we have to do. And number one obstacle is privatization. If we want to attract private money into the country, we need to relaunch privatization. The last big transparent privatization happened in 2005. It was a privatization of Kryvyi-Rostali, big steel manufacturer. It was bought by Mittal Steels at that time for a record amount of money. And that's the example of how we should do privatization. So I do believe, in high economic growth, but I know what it takes to get there. So it's a hard work, and we will get the numbers of 6-7%.
You've talked about energy reform as being one of the major focuses of Ukraine's reforms. Could you explain what the energy reforms have been, how they're working, and what you hope to achieve by this process? Subsidies and so on. The energy reform is, there are several components to it, right? There is, in every sector, there is own reform agenda. So in gas sector, in electricity, but the main goal of it is to introduce competition. The energy sector was one of the most least reformed for years. It actually came from the Soviet Union, when there was a state economy with no competition. And it's not how it should be. In gas sector, what we want to have is that the private investors buying a right to explore and produce gas, for example, they should have free access, not free, for money, market, right? But, unrestricted access to the gas transport infrastructure. Otherwise, they produce something, you cannot sell it, right? Then, very important part is the tariff reforms. If the price at which a resource is sold is below cost or not market level, then obviously there is no motivation for companies to produce or to invest into production. Or, that was historically true as well, there is enormous opportunities for manipulating with resources that actually, on paper sold below the cost. Then it is enormous temptation for somebody who has access to the resource to sell it at the market prices somewhere, right? And claim it sold it below a regulated price.
So basically, there is a lot of problems. What we do in the gas market is we transform from the state monopoly NAK Naftogaz, which now produce gas, transport gas, stores gas, and trade gas, supply gas, right? We restructure this company, and we create all the segment where possible. For example, transportation cannot be competition there. It's a monopoly which is regulated. But for everything else, there should be competition. There should be different, more traders. There should be anyone who wants to produce gas should have ability to do this. And whoever wants to have access to the gas storages, please, that's or shared use. Just pay for it. And that's every sector. Similar thing with electricity market. So it's a big reform which cannot be done for 1 year, but we're about to complete it.
You had mentioned also that both large companies and households really didn't pay market prices for particularly natural gas. How does the reform affect these segments, and is it helping to conserve the use of the resource by putting a realistic price on these things?
Yes, actually, quite recently, when the prices were below market level, then the consumers, they bought it cheap, and they weren't interested in saving because they don't pay much. Why should they save? Well, the reality is that we as a state subsidize these people, and eventually this is their money, taxpayers' money, that we just somehow put through the system so that they can get a cheaper price for gas, which is ridiculous. So as a result, we had this, problem for the budget, no savings on the gas. Political element of this is dependency on Russia, unacceptable. Now we move prices to the market level. It changes the behavior because now those who pay, and everybody pays market prices, it's a big cost. It's a big cost. So people start to save. They are motivated to save. Of course, a lot of people get state subsidies. So if they don't have, their income does not allow them, to cover the cost of utility, but not all of it, but not everything should be paid from not all income should go to the subsidy, but certain level, right? It's above 15%. So then the state covers the rest. It also actually it's also part of solution, because those who receive subsidies, significant part of it, they're also not interested in saving because they know that the state will pay for them. The state used to provide them cheap resource. Now they just provide money and subsidies, and for them cost is limited. So we try with our reforms, we also try to stimulate people to save. So it's not just level of tariffs stimulates savings of consumptions, right? But also subsidy system should also stimulate. So if people do not invest in energy efficiency, do not implement any measures, then they should lose at least partially rights to the subsidy. Then they're motivated, and then eventually everybody wins. They will introduce energy efficiency measures. They will pay less for the tax. They will consume less. The state will become less dependent on Russia. Or I can tell you even, with right energy efficiency measures, we will not import any cubical meter of gas. We could become an exporter of gas. It takes some time.
And this, of course, is not just about households, but about industrial companies, where an industrial company in the Soviet system would have a very low price of gas, so investments would be based on that and uneconomic, perhaps, in market forces. Yeah. So a gas reform really implies a wholesale industrial restructuring and reform. Am I right about that?
That's right. That already happening for a number of years because the price for the industry was moved on the market level quite a long time ago. Yeah, some businesses were just selling gas. It's just different way of. For example, some fertilizers, right? Is just historically, it's just a very strange business of selling a solid gas. So of course, it's not economically feasible under current situation.
And so you're increasing gas production already. Has Ukraine been able to increase its gas production, or is that still in the future?
It's increasing. We made one mistake in 2014. We increased royalties for the gas production. And unfortunately, at that time, I couldn't stop this decision. And that actually sent a signal to those who, any gas, any investments, they cannot be repaid within 1 year, right? Usually it's long-term investors. And so what investors in the gas sector, energy sector seek is some predictability. And we made one mistake in 2014 that we later on reversed, right? But it sent a bad signal to investors that, the rates could increase, and there was some actually drop in investments, and that, as a result, we didn't get more increase of production than we expected. But we learned the lesson. I think everybody learned the lesson now. And we now, expect, first of all, we demonstrate that we have a stable environment, we provide stable regulation, and that will lead to the increase of the production, both in private sector and in state sector, because state-owned company, one of our largest companies, Ukrgaz-Vidobывание, they now have a lot of resources after we adjusted tariffs to the market level, a lot of resources to reinvest into new technologies. Fracking, and that they put a lot of money into it, in this technology, and it brings results. It brings results that we wanted to achieve.
So Ukraine is beginning to frack, and it's producing natural gas this way.
Yes.
Very interesting. I think fracking may be the least popular technique in the Kremlin.
We need to consider everything, yeah. That make them happy.
All right. Corruption has been something people have often identified as a problem in Ukraine. How serious is corruption now? Do people have figures in terms of percentage of GDP or flows of money? How much does corruption cost Ukraine?
It's really difficult to assess it in dollar terms, right? It's difficult to assess, how many foreign companies would he have in Ukraine if they, for example, didn't face some corruption, several years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Maybe they will be here already, right? So it's difficult to actually put some numbers on it. What is very important, and I can certify this, was my meeting with businesses. Some businesses haven't seen corruption since, they started the business. I met recently with IT Association, and I meet quite regularly with different industries to understand what problem they have and how we as a ministry or the government could help them. And it was an interesting question of one of the participants. He said, when I go to the market to raise some money, investors ask me about corruption. How should I explain? Because I didn't face anything, right? For the last 3 years, and I started the company, I didn't have any. I told him, say what it is, right? I think this problem is exaggerated. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It exists. But the fight with corruption brings results. I just told you recently about the arrest of the head of State Fiscal Service, right, for corruption charges. One of the initiatives that we as a ministry did, we implemented the new tool for administrating the VAT refunds, transparent, which eliminates corruption in this area that was the most notorious for years and years. So these actions, practical actions, answer your question. It's easier to answer it, philosophically, but practical actions like VAT refunds, changing the way some taxes are administrated, actually remove corruption possibilities within state fiscal service. And that's what people notice, and they react to this positively.
Yep. In terms of whether it's asset recovery or some kind of making it more difficult for large-scale Ukrainian corrupt operators to move their money offshore, are there ways you would like to get more or better cooperation from international financial authorities?
We're actually getting such support. We're already getting such support. And this is without this, it's not even support, it's cooperation, right? Mm-hmm. I think in the modern world, in the global world, we should move from the way like support this word. Everyone is interdependent, right? You don't want, Americans don't want, some money, for example, flee to other countries, including Ukraine, right? And vice versa. One of the initiatives that we've done, we joined since 1st of January 2017. We joined the BEPS action plan to actually fight the base tax erosion, and that's we become the part of international community. We'll use the same practices how to fight this. How to make sure that what the value is created in Ukraine is being taxed in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The offshore money being sent to offshore, it was also a problem. There is less of a problem now. The problem now is to bring this money back, because that money were made in Ukraine and need to be in Ukraine. So that's how we work. What we're working on. But it's not just enforcing this money to bring back. It's our duty to also improve the business climate. Whatever money is outside, it's money that they could be brought in either by force or by creating a right business environment. And we're doing both. But without right business environment, even enforcement will not work.
So you're thinking in some cases it sounds like that rather than simply suing someone who has their money overseas to try to bring it back, you would be willing, Ukraine might be willing to work out a system where they bring it back for investment and...
Yes, clearly yes. Mm-hmm. Again, it's also not right just to use the enforcement mechanism. Eventually we want all the money, whoever wants to invest in Ukraine should be free to do this. Right? We want to create such opportunity, such a magnet that will attract the money to the country, because that's the employment, that's salaries, that's the future of our people.
Okay, great. Well, I have probably monopolized our guest long enough, so we should turn to the audience for questions and comments now. And I've asked one of our Hudson Fellows, Hannah Thoburn, who had the misfortune at one point of being one of my students, so is entitled to some kind of compensation, to take over the duty of calling on people in the audience. This, of course, means she will have the right for at least one question herself. So, Hannah, would you get up? And do we have a microphone for people? We do have microphones, so when Hannah calls on you, please wait for the microphone. When the microphone comes, ask a question. A question is a short statement that would be punctuated if it appeared in print with a question mark. And also, please identify yourself so we'll know who it is, and so our friends watching on the internet will know who it is. So, Hannah, you want to come up and start? So why don't you come up and where you can look at people? Is mic working?
All right, so I didn't know I was going to get this particular privilege, but thank you very much, Walter and Minister Daniluk. So I guess I'll go ahead and ask the first question and ask a little bit about the situation you find yourself in with the IMF. You've just received another $1 billion tranche. What kind of requirements has the IMF set out for receiving the next tranche, for moving forward in this $17.5 billion program I believe you have with the IMF? What are the next steps in reform that Ukraine needs to take?
Yeah, in fact, this is another thing which I had to mention, is that just a year ago, when the new government was put in place, there was a lot of skepticism about the continuation of IMF program. And we renewed cooperation and we reached staff-level agreements within 3 weeks of new government taking place. So it's a very right question, right? Since then, we received 2 tranches. We've done a lot of things within the program, but a lot of things was done outside the program, which are also very important for the country. Going forward, there are several preconditions for next tranche. The very important is a pension reform. So without pension reform, there will be no tranche. But remember what I said in my speech, right? Is not because IMF needs it, it's because we need to do this reform. We owe this reform to our citizens. We owe this reform. So this is what we're going to do. And IMF supports us in this.
All right, go ahead and start with questions here in the front.
Elaine Soreo, I'm the Associate Rector of WIUU in Kiev, Ukraine. This has been wonderful to hear you speak today. I'd like to specifically ask 2 questions that both have to do with accountability, transparency, and privatization regarding, particularly as it relates to the pension aspects. Could you elaborate? Last year, this time, I was in Kiev and talking to government officials about accountability and transparency. And could you, one, talk about how you've moved forward, specifically on not just the accountability, but the transparency for the Ukrainian public, so that they have a knowledge base of what you're doing, and at the same time, how that knowledge base can translate to their support for not just privatization, but how it impacts on their pension aspects. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As I explained at the very beginning, that I've been in different stages of doing reforms in the country. What I learned is very important to be fully transparent. There are no things that you cannot explain to people. And if you can't explain it, or afraid of doing this, that there is a very high chance of failure. Just don't even start. So what we're doing in the ministry, and some other ministries doing the same, is when we're working on policy making, right, we engaged, we don't put any restrictions. We engage all experts who wants to take part in it, right? Where we openly, for example, when we did changes to the tax code, all experts who wanted to take part of it, they done it. It delayed the process. You know, it delayed the process. We worked for 4 months. Sometimes you lose temper, right? Because you want to see the result of all these actions. But at least during this process, we see, you know, that we have more and more supporters. Those who come with crazy ideas understand that maybe they're not workable, you know. Those who, you know, don't believe in certain actions, they started to believe that this is the right thing to do. And as a result, the changes to the tax code that we started developing it last summer, you know, were adopted by the parliament, and there were no single voice saying that it's the wrong thing to do. They were afraid to go against, you know, reform which is widely supported. And it gave me opportunity now to reform the VAT register, to reform SFS, to change some tax policies. And I'm now free to do it because I've got this. I started right. I started from being fully transparent to include everyone who wants to do it. That's about transparency. Accountability. Well, it's not how we improve it. It's not how. I think it's already expected that, everyone is judged by what, he or she did. That's already not in the culture, or maybe in the culture already. It's already there, because people have seen enough people who tell a lot and don't do anything. Just look on IMF program. Again, very big difference. We being criticized by Yulia Tymoshenko, who is now in a position, but she used to be prime minister, and she was a reliable partner of IMF for some time. So, she promised a lot. She signed the right documents. She was receiving money and then didn't do anything. As a result, we're still repaying this debt, and the country is not reformed. So the weak, unreformed economy have to repay the money that actually you only use in order to change something dramatically. So, that's example of a responsibility, and the fact that she's not supported now. This is also people understand that this is a responsible behavior, and she's accountable for this. What we're doing is in our IMF program, first of all, we do what we believe is the right thing to do, right? And we, comparing to the previous programs, for every dollar that is borrowed from IMF, the amount of, real kind of how even to translate it to some numbers, but the effect from reforms on the dollar attracted from IMF is uncomparable to any other programs. That's also is accountability, because I'm accountable for every dollar we get. I know that we'll have to repay it. So I want to use, and my colleagues in the government, that's why we're so much focused on the reforms, because we want to demonstrate people that, we're not, we're different. We're changing the country.
Next question to Anders.
Thank you very much. My name is Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. Everybody tells me now that you are the anchor of reform in the government, and you talked about one of the major reforms on the agenda now, the land market law. How do you think that it should be done, and how do you see the politics in Parliament around the land market reform? I won't ask if you think that you will get it done, because you will have to say yes on that. Thank you.
The land market reform is, belated reform for many years. For those who don't understand, I just repeat again that after Ukraine became independent, citizens in Ukraine got right to privatize land, and they've done it. And the prospects were normal market, circulation. Those who want to use land accumulate, who don't, they sell. But no. Somehow, Parliament decided at that time that people should be deprived from their rights to use the land which they own. In a unique situation. And for all these years, since the moratorium on sale of agricultural land in place, people forgot, the people who own land now, they even don't know what it means. And they somehow got into this old negative image about it, saying like, okay, if the market is open, then, the only thing that you have is land. You will have to sell it cheap. There will be some big boys, oligarchs, or foreigners, Americans. It changes. It just changes depending where Ukraine is. Either oligarchs will come and buy everything, or Americans, or Chinese. At one point it was Russians. But there is always a threat that somebody will come and buy it. People maybe don't understand that, even if you buy land, you cannot take it out of the country. So this was years of negative PR about this. And passing it through the parliament will not be easy. It will be a very complicated thing to do. Also, who would oppose it is some companies which now lease this land cheap and who don't want to distract their business, for their business to be distracted, because if market is launched, then basically large land banks, they might use some pieces of it. It's a risk. But again, fundamentally, we're talking about private property rights, which it's fundamental, right? So I believe in a reform that to put minimum restrictions on the land market. I do understand that we need to start with the first stage to allow the farmers to buy the land, to secure the land, and for that, the part of the reform should include a financing. Those who wants to buy land, farmers, for example, and they don't have means, we as a state should provide financing for them to do that, right? But then the market should be open to everyone with a minimum limitation. And that will give a huge boost to the development of agricultural sector, because those who own land, they want to attract financing, they will be able to borrow against the land, right? Agricultural companies will be able to capitalize on the land that they acquire, because at the moment, they cannot do this. This is not their land. In 5 years, it will not be theirs. There is no security. But when you own the land, then of course, your value is higher. It will not be easy, but at the moment, we are very committed to pushing it through the parliament. And that was one of the most important reforms, together with pension reforms, that will change the country and its economy.
All right, so we're going to take 3 last questions here all at once, and then bring our session here to a close. So the first question will go all the way in the back to the lady in the red.
Yulia Tymoshenko is initiating referendum.
We're going to introduce.
I thought it's for your name.
Voice of America, Ukrainian service, Irina Matvichik. Yulia Tymoshenko is initiating referendum on the land reform. She want to ask people what do they think about selling land to big corporations and foreigners. What's the future of this referendum, in your opinion? And my question also, what's the best way to fill the pension fund budget? Is there alternative to the increasing of pension age in Ukraine? Thank you.
And then the next question to the gentleman there in the back.
Mm-hmm.
I need to understand. I'm a student at Howard University. I wanted to know about Ukraine's surplus and deficit, and maybe what they're going to do as far as trade-offs with other countries to make their economy a little bit stronger.
And then the final question to the woman here in the front.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with Breitbart News. Back to the energy independence. Could you expand on fracking and who's helping Ukraine with that technology? Is the U.S. involved in helping you? And what are the prospects for that helping your energy independence? Thank you.
Thank you.
So 3 questions on energy independence, Yulia Tymoshenko and land reform, more general question about Ukrainian economy, and anything else you may want to add here at the end.
I'll start with Yulia Tymoshenko, because when you start your question, I thought that you're introducing yourself, and I was a bit confused. Maybe it's wrong, but I didn't hear about this referendum. Today's news, I haven't read today's news, so, I'm not surprised, and I don't care. Populists will always try to play their games. We know what we're doing. It's the right thing for the economy. People like her, also talking about accountability, responsible for the fact that, for the state where we are in the moment. Because of her, we were dependent on Russia for so many years on the gas. Because of her, some of the reforms that could have been done many years ago, they still haven't done. So, populists do their own things. We have our own agenda to implement. What was another question? Sorry, was. It's the pension reform is more than just filling up the pension fund, right? It's more than that. Unfortunately, what we have at the moment is an unfair system with a lot of disbalances and flows. So it is not just how to bring more revenues to pension fund. It's actually it's also to make sure that the pension could be received. People have entitlement as those who actually have right for this, right? What we about to implement is a complex of measures that make system fair. Those who work and contribute to the pension fund, they have right for the retirement at a certain age. Those who didn't, for different reasons, maybe they didn't want to work, maybe they can't work, they couldn't work, or maybe they work but illegally, right? They won't be able to retire at the age when those who actually work could do. So it's more than just extra source for revenues. And again, fair pension system is the fairness of the system is something which allows us to come to people and say, support it. If it's unfair, it's, even if it gets nice elements of reducing the fiscal deficit and other elements, if it's unfair, people will not accept it. So fairness is very important. And this is the key element of our pension reform. On the deficit, the part of IMF program, we reduce our budget deficit every year, right? Last year it was 3.7%. This year is 3%, and that has continued to drop with 2.5% year after, and then 2.2% at the end of the program. It's very important to do this, and we very carefully during the budget process adhere to this. Sometimes it means that we have to make unpopular decisions, but we do it. It's very important for us to reduce it. In terms of energy efficiency, I really don't know which technology is being used. And in ideal situation, I even shouldn't worry about this. We should create, again, I'm just a believer in, I'm slightly unusual for Minister of Finance being a libertarian, but this is my belief. This is maybe first and last time in the history of Ukraine. But I do believe that we need to think about the proper regulation. And then the private business will come and they will use the most efficient technologies. US is the most advanced at this front at the moment, right? So I'm sure US technology is being used. But pretty much it should be the choice of business. Whatever is more effective should be put in use. Thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking both Walter Russell Mead, Minister Danylyuk. We wish you the very best in all of your reforms, in taking apart the old tax police and everything else you have to do this year, everything that's on your agenda. So please join me in thanking both of these gentlemen for their time today.
Thank you.